HOA President Diane Caldwell entered my backyard without permission 23 times, but she never expected my evidence, legal strategy, and $28,500 claim to expose the truth behind her abuse of authority. Welcome back, everyone. Before today's story begins, I want to thank each and every one of you for being here. If this is your first time on the channel, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you'll always know when a new story is released. Your support means more than you know. Every like, comment, and subscription helps this channel grow and allows us to keep sharing incredible stories with viewers around the world. And before we begin, tell me this, where are you watching from today? Drop your location in the comments. I always enjoy seeing how far these stories travel. Now, grab a comfortable seat, relax, and let's dive into today's unforgettable story. The first time I saw Diane Caldwell standing behind my fence, I thought she had made a mistake. The 23rd time, I realized the mistake was mine for believing she would ever respect a boundary she didn't believe existed. My name is Caleb Montgomery, and before this happened, I was just a homeowner who wanted a peaceful life in Maple Ridge Estates. I wasn't looking for conflict with my neighbors. I wasn't interested in fighting with the HOA. Like most people, I believe community rules existed to keep things organized and fair. But Diane Caldwell, the president of our HOA board, saw those rules differently. To her, they weren't just guidelines. They were a source of authority. And slowly, that authority started extending beyond where it belonged. The first time Diane entered my backyard, I was outside trimming some branches near my fence. I remember hearing the sound of footsteps behind me and turning around to see her standing near my garden area with a folder in her hand. She looked completely comfortable, almost like she belonged there. I asked if everything was okay and why she was on my property. She didn't look surprised by the question. She simply said she was checking a possible community compliance issue. I looked around my own backyard and then back at her. "Did you notify me before coming onto my property?" I asked. Diane gave a small smile and explained that the HOA had responsibilities to maintain neighborhood standards. The way she said it made it clear she wasn't asking for permission. She believed she already had it. I didn't argue that day. I asked her to leave, and she eventually walked back toward the street. But something about that moment stayed with me. It wasn't just that she entered my property. It was the confidence behind it. There was no hesitation, no apology, no understanding that a line had been crossed. A few days later, I noticed something strange when reviewing my home security footage. There she was again. Diane was walking along the side of my house, looking at areas that were completely private. She wasn't at the sidewalk. She wasn't near a shared space. She was inside my property line. I watched the footage twice because I wanted to make sure I wasn't misunderstanding what I saw. But the video was clear. Diane had entered my property without asking. That night, instead of confronting her, I opened a folder on my computer and started documenting everything. I created a simple record with dates, times, and details of each incident. At first, I thought it would only contain 1 or 2 entries. I was wrong. Over the next several weeks, I noticed the same pattern repeating. Diane would appear near my property, and shortly afterward, I would receive an HOA message about some unrelated issue. A landscaping concern, a maintenance question, a reminder about neighborhood standards. Each message seemed normal by itself. But when I placed them beside the camera footage, they created a pattern I could no longer ignore. Diane wasn't simply checking the neighborhood. She was using her position to create access. That was when I realized I needed to understand exactly what power the HOA actually had. Because there is a difference between managing a community and acting like you own someone else's home. And Diane Caldwell was about to learn that every step across my property line was leaving behind something she never expected. Evidence. The more I looked into Diane Caldwell's actions, the more I realized something uncomfortable. She wasn't breaking boundaries because she didn't understand them. She was breaking them because she believed nobody would stop her. After creating my first records of Diane entering my property, I stopped treating each incident like an isolated problem. I started looking for a pattern. And once I found it, I couldn't ignore what was happening. Every time Diane appeared near my home, there was usually an HOA message waiting shortly afterward. A reminder, a request, a warning about maintaining community standards. At first, I thought those messages were just typical HOA communication. But when I placed them beside my security footage, the connection became impossible to overlook. Diane was using her position as HOA president to create reasons for being on my property. She wasn't simply checking shared areas. She was stepping into private space and expecting everyone to accept it. That was the moment I decided to stop relying on conversations and start building a complete record. I created a timeline on my computer with every incident I could verify. The first entry showed the day Diane entered my backyard while claiming she was checking compliance. The second showed her walking along the side of my house without any notice. The third showed her inspecting an area that had nothing to do with community property. Each entry had the same details: date, time, location, and what happened before and after. I wasn't trying to create a dramatic story. I was trying to create an accurate one. Because when someone has authority, facts matter more than opinions. A few days later, I received another HOA email from Diane. The message looked professional, but the meaning behind it felt familiar. She requested access to inspect part of my property because she claimed there were possible concerns that needed to be reviewed. I stared at the screen for several minutes. Months earlier, that email would have made me uncomfortable. I might have wondered if I was causing unnecessary conflict. But now I saw something different. Diane was asking. She was no longer simply walking in. Somewhere along the way, she had realized that permission mattered. I responded calmly and asked her to provide the specific HOA provision that allowed access to private property without homeowner approval. I didn't accuse her. I didn't threaten legal action. I simply asked for the rule she believed gave her that authority. Her response came the next day. But instead of providing a clear answer, she repeated the same general statements about protecting the neighborhood and maintaining standards. That answer told me everything I needed to know. Real authority can explain its limits. False authority avoids questions. I began reviewing the HOA governing documents myself. I read every section connected to inspections, enforcement, and homeowner responsibilities. What I discovered was exactly what I suspected. The HOA had responsibilities, but those responsibilities had boundaries. Shared community areas were not the same as private property. Maintaining standards did not mean entering someone's backyard whenever someone wanted. The rules Diane used to pressure residents were becoming the same rules that would eventually expose her mistake. That night, I saved another copy of my evidence folder and looked at everything together. The videos, the emails, the timeline, the documents. What started as a homeowner wondering if he was overreacting had become something much bigger. Diane believed every visit showed her control. She didn't realize every visit was creating a record, and every record was bringing me closer to the moment when she would finally have to answer one simple question. Where exactly did she get permission to cross my property line? The moment I stopped asking whether Diane Caldwell was crossing the line was the moment I started asking how many times she had crossed it before I noticed. I spent the next few weeks reviewing everything connected to the HOA and my property. I wasn't searching for a way to attack Diane. I was trying to understand the truth. Because when someone holds a position of authority, the details matter. The facts matter. And the more I looked, the clearer the pattern became. I checked every camera recording stored in my system. Some clips were only a few seconds long, but together they told a much bigger story. Diane walking near my backyard. Diane standing beside my driveway. Diane examining areas that had nothing to do with shared community spaces. Each moment alone might have been dismissed as a misunderstanding. But combined, they showed repeated behavior. I created a detailed timeline and labeled every incident carefully. Date, time, location, what happened before, what happened after. I wanted anyone looking at it to understand exactly what occurred without needing my personal opinion. That was important to me. I didn't want a story built on frustration. I wanted a record built on facts. While organizing the footage, I noticed something else. Diane's visits often happened shortly before HOA messages arrived. A landscaping concern would appear after she walked around my yard. A maintenance question would follow after she inspected part of my property. It felt like every visit created a reason for another message. That was when I realized the issue wasn't only about where she stepped. It was about how she was using her position. She was creating a system where her authority came first and explanations came later. I decided to review the HOA governing documents in detail. I spent evenings reading through the rules that Diane constantly referenced whenever she contacted residents. I looked at sections about inspections, violations, shared spaces, and homeowner responsibilities. I expected to find something that explained her confidence. Instead, I found something very different. The documents gave the HOA certain responsibilities, but they also clearly defined limits. The HOA could manage common areas. It could enforce reasonable standards. But those powers did not automatically allow someone to enter private property whenever they wanted. That distinction became the most important discovery I made. Diane wasn't protecting a community rule. She was stretching a rule beyond its purpose. A few days later, I received another message from her. This time, she requested access to inspect my backyard because she claimed there were possible compliance concerns. I read the email carefully. Months earlier, I might have felt pressured to agree immediately, but now I understood the difference between cooperation and surrendering my rights. I replied politely and asked her to provide the specific HOA provision that authorized entry onto private property without homeowner permission. I waited for her response. The answer came the following afternoon. But instead of citing a rule, Diane repeated the same phrases she had used before. She talked about community standards. She talked about responsibility. She talked about protecting property values. But she never answered the one question I asked. Where was the permission? That silence was more revealing than any argument could have been. Real authority does not need to avoid simple questions. That night, I saved the email and added it to my growing file. The folder on my computer now contained videos, messages, documents, and a timeline of every step Diane had taken. She believed each visit proved she was in control. She didn't realize every visit was becoming another piece of evidence. And soon, all of those pieces would come together. I used to think rules existed to keep people organized. Diane Caldwell taught me something different. Rules can also become dangerous when the person enforcing them believes those rules make them untouchable. After reviewing the HOA documents and comparing them with my evidence, I knew I had to take the next step. I needed to understand exactly where Diane's authority ended and where my rights as a homeowner began. So I continued studying every document connected to Maple Ridge Estates. I looked through the HOA bylaws, enforcement policies, and homeowner guidelines. I wasn't searching for a way to attack Diane. I was searching for the truth. The more I read, the clearer the situation became. The HOA had legitimate responsibilities. It could maintain common areas. It could address real violations. It could protect the appearance and value of the neighborhood. But none of those responsibilities gave Diane unlimited access to private property. That line was written clearly. Shared spaces belonged to the community. My backyard belonged to me. My driveway belonged to me. My home was not an extension of the HOA office. That discovery changed the way I viewed the entire situation. Before, I thought Diane was simply being overly aggressive. Now, I understood that she had created a completely different problem. She wasn't enforcing rules. She was rewriting them to fit what she wanted. I organized all my evidence into separate sections. The first folder contained security footage. The second contained every email and notice from Diane. The third contained HOA documents showing exactly what the association could and could not do. I wanted everything arranged clearly because I knew emotions would not matter if this situation continued. Evidence would. A few days later, Diane sent another message. This time, she sounded more careful. She requested access to inspect my backyard because she claimed there were possible concerns about my property. I read the message slowly. The Diane from weeks earlier would have simply appeared at my fence. This Diane was asking for permission. That small change told me something important. She knew the situation was different now. I replied with a professional response. I explained that I was willing to cooperate with legitimate HOA requests, but any inspection of private property would require proper authorization and a clear explanation of the applicable rule. I wasn't refusing to work with the HOA. I was asking them to respect the same process they expected homeowners to follow. Diane's response came the next day. Instead of providing a specific rule, she repeated the same general statements about maintaining neighborhood standards and protecting property values. But she still avoided answering the question. Where did the HOA document allow her to enter private property without permission? That question remained unanswered. And that was the moment I realized something. Diane's greatest weakness wasn't a lack of confidence. It was too much confidence. She believed everyone would accept her interpretation without checking the details. She believed the title of HOA president gave her the final word. But titles don't create unlimited power. They create responsibility. That night, I sat at my desk and looked at the evidence folder on my screen. The number of files had grown. Videos, emails, documents, notes. Every piece connected to the same story. Diane had spent months trying to prove she had control over my property. Without realizing it, she had created a complete record showing exactly why she didn't. And I knew the next step would determine whether she finally understood the difference between authority and overreach. I always believed the strongest position in any argument belonged to the person who had the facts. What I didn't realize was that Diane Caldwell had been collecting evidence against herself with every decision she made. After confirming the limits of HOA authority, I knew I couldn't simply wait and hope the situation would fix itself. Diane had already shown me that she was comfortable crossing boundaries. The only way to stop the pattern was to create a record so clear that nobody could ignore it. I started preparing everything carefully. I printed copies of every email. I organized every security recording by date. I highlighted the exact sections in the HOA documents that explained homeowner rights and association responsibilities. The process was slow, but I wasn't in a hurry. I understood something important. People who rely on intimidation expect emotional reactions. They expect anger. They expect arguments that can be dismissed. They don't expect patience. They don't expect preparation. And they definitely don't expect someone to quietly build a case. A few days later, Diane made another move. She sent a formal HOA notice claiming that my property required an inspection due to possible community concerns. The letter looked official. It had the HOA logo at the top, professional wording, and a signature from Diane herself. For someone who didn't know the details, it might have seemed intimidating. But after everything I had discovered, I saw the letter differently. It wasn't a warning. It was another piece of evidence. Diane was putting her intentions in writing. She was confirming that she wanted access to my property. I placed the notice beside my other documents and studied the wording carefully. She never mentioned emergency conditions. She never referenced a specific violation. She simply relied on the idea that her position should be enough. That was the same mistake she had been making from the beginning. She confused authority with permission. I decided it was time to respond officially. I wrote a detailed letter explaining that I respected the HOA's role, but requested clarification regarding the specific rule allowing access to private property without homeowner approval. I included references to the governing documents and asked for all future communication regarding inspections to follow the proper process. Before sending it, I read the letter several times. Every sentence was calm. Every statement was factual. There was no anger, no personal attack, just a homeowner asking for the same accountability expected from everyone else. When Diane received my response, I expected another confident reply. Instead, there was a delay. Several days passed without an answer. That silence told me more than any message could have. Diane was used to people accepting her statements without questioning them. She was not used to someone asking her to prove them. During that time, I continued reviewing the footage. I counted every documented visit. I checked every timestamp. I created a complete timeline from the first incident to the most recent one. The number surprised even me. 23 separate entries. 23 moments when Diane believed nobody was paying attention. 23 opportunities for her to assume there would be no consequences. But now those moments existed permanently in my records. They were no longer memories. They were evidence. And that was when I started thinking about what accountability actually looked like. I didn't want Diane embarrassed. I didn't want a neighborhood war. I wanted a clear message that applied to everyone. Rules protect communities only when they are followed by the people enforcing them. Diane had spent months proving she believed she was above those rules. She never realized she was creating the exact proof needed to show she wasn't. The moment I decided to calculate the damage was the moment I stopped seeing Diane Caldwell's actions as a misunderstanding. They were choices, and every choice had created a consequence she never expected. I spent several nights reviewing the timeline I had built. 23 separate entries. 23 moments where Diane crossed into my private property without proper permission. I looked at each recording carefully, not because I wanted to punish her, but because I needed to understand the full impact of what had happened. Every homeowner deserves to feel safe inside their own boundaries. That feeling had been taken away from me every time Diane treated my property like an extension of the HOA office. I began organizing the final report. The first section explained the history of the situation. The second showed the documented entries from security footage. The third included the HOA rules that clearly explained the limits of association authority. The final section addressed the consequences of repeated unauthorized access. I wanted the report to tell the story without emotion. Anyone reading it should be able to see the facts and understand exactly what happened. Before taking the next step, I reviewed everything with a property rights consultant. I placed the entire file in front of them and waited as they examined the documents. They watched several clips from the security footage. They reviewed Diane's emails. They compared her statements with the HOA guidelines. After several minutes, they looked at me and said something I already felt was true. The strongest part of your case is the pattern. One mistake can be explained. 23 documented incidents create a completely different picture. That sentence stayed with me. The problem wasn't one moment of poor judgment. It was a repeated belief that the rules applied differently to her. After that conversation, I calculated the impact of each documented violation. The number that appeared on the final report was $28,500. It wasn't created out of anger. It wasn't meant to scare anyone. It represented accountability for the repeated actions that Diane chose to take. I printed the final notice and placed it inside an envelope. For a moment, I just sat there looking at it on my desk. I remembered the first day I saw her behind my fence. I remembered wondering if challenging the HOA would make my life harder. I remembered questioning whether I should simply ignore it and move on. But ignoring it would have sent the wrong message. It would have told Diane that confidence was more powerful than responsibility. The next morning, I delivered the notice through the proper process. I didn't confront her in person. I didn't create a scene. I didn't need to. The documents spoke for themselves. When Diane received the claim, I knew she would finally have to face something she had avoided from the beginning. Questions. Not the questions homeowners were expected to answer for the HOA, but the questions she had never expected anyone to ask her. Where was the permission? Where was the authority? Where was the rule that allowed her to cross that boundary? A few days passed, and I noticed a change. Diane's messages became different. The confident tone was gone. The statements became more careful. The person who once walked across my property without hesitation was now choosing every word carefully. That was when I realized the balance had shifted. Diane thought her position gave her control over the situation. She didn't understand that every step she took had moved her closer to accountability. The same rules she used to pressure others were now the rules protecting me. The day Diane Caldwell opened my $28,500 claim, I imagined she would be angry. I imagined she would deny everything. What I didn't expect was the silence that followed, because silence was something Diane had never given me before. After delivering the notice through the proper process, I waited. I didn't contact Diane. I didn't chase a response. I didn't try to convince anyone that I was right. The evidence was already there. The documents were already organized. For the first time since this situation began, the responsibility was no longer on me to explain what happened. It was on Diane to explain her actions. Several days passed before I received her first response. The tone was completely different from the messages I had received before. There were no demands, no statements about HOA authority, no reminders about community standards. Instead, the message carefully suggested that there may have been misunderstandings regarding property access. I read that word several times. Misunderstanding. That was the same situation Diane had created from the beginning. She wanted every decision to appear accidental. But 23 documented entries were not a misunderstanding. They were a pattern. I replied professionally and confirmed that I was willing to discuss the matter through the appropriate HOA process. I wanted the facts reviewed by everyone involved. Not because I needed approval, but because accountability works best when everything is visible. A private argument could become a disagreement between two people. A documented review would show the truth. The HOA board scheduled a meeting to discuss the situation. Before walking into that room, I reviewed my file one more time. I looked at the first video, the first email, the first moment when I realized something wasn't right. I remembered how uncertain I felt at the beginning. I wondered if standing up for my property would create unnecessary problems. But looking at the evidence now, I knew I had made the right choice. At the meeting, Diane arrived with the same professional appearance she always had. She carried a folder. She sat confidently. For a moment, it looked like every other HOA meeting I had seen before. But there was one difference. This time, everyone at the table had the same information. Diane could no longer control the story by simply explaining it first. The board members reviewed the timeline. They looked through the security footage. They compared her statements with the HOA documents. I watched as the conversation slowly changed. At the beginning, Diane talked about protecting the neighborhood. She talked about responsibilities and maintaining standards. But as the evidence was reviewed, the discussion moved toward one simple issue: permission. The board asked Diane where the HOA documents allowed her to enter private property without homeowner approval. She paused. She looked through her notes. She explained that she believed she was acting within her role. But belief was not the same as authorization. That was the difference she had ignored for months. The meeting continued for several hours. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody needed to. The facts were enough. By the end of the discussion, the board recognized that the situation required a formal review of HOA procedures. They agreed that property access rules needed to be clearer and that future actions would require proper documentation. Sitting there, I realized something important. The goal was never to make Diane lose. The goal was to make sure the rules applied equally. Diane thought her position protected her from consequences. She never expected those same rules to become the reason she had to answer for her actions. I watched Diane Caldwell walk into that HOA meeting believing she was still the person in control. But by the time the last document was placed on the table, everyone in that room understood something she never expected. The rules were no longer protecting her. They were exposing her. After the initial review, the HOA board decided to conduct a deeper examination of Diane's actions. For the first time, her decisions were being analyzed the same way she had analyzed homeowners for years. Every detail mattered. Every document mattered. Every assumption had to be supported by facts. I provided the board with the complete file I had prepared. The security footage showed the repeated entries. The emails showed the communication pattern. The HOA documents showed the limits of her authority. Nothing was based on emotion. Everything was connected. During the meeting, Diane tried to explain her perspective. She said she was only trying to maintain neighborhood standards. She said her intention was never to create conflict. I listened quietly because I wanted her to finish. I understood that intention was part of the conversation. But intention could not erase what happened. Someone could believe they were helping and still cross a line. That was the difference Diane had failed to recognize. The board members continued reviewing the timeline. They looked at the first incident, then the second, then every documented visit afterward. With each piece of information, the situation became clearer. This was not about one accidental step across a boundary. It was about repeated decisions made without proper authorization. One board member asked Diane a question that changed the entire atmosphere of the room. If a homeowner had entered another resident's property 23 times without permission, would the HOA consider that acceptable? Nobody answered immediately. The question stayed there. Because everyone understood the comparison. The same standard had to apply in both directions. Diane had spent months reminding homeowners that rules existed for a reason. Now she was being asked to follow those same principles herself. She attempted to explain that the HOA president sometimes needed flexibility when handling concerns. But flexibility did not mean unlimited access. Responsibility did not mean ownership. A leadership position did not remove personal boundaries. As the meeting continued, several homeowners shared their thoughts. Some admitted they had experienced similar situations where they felt pressured by HOA decisions. Others said they had never questioned the authority behind certain requests until they saw my documentation. That was the moment I realized this situation had grown beyond my backyard. The issue was no longer just about Diane and me. It was about making sure every homeowner understood their rights. By the end of the meeting, the board agreed that changes were necessary. They discussed clearer procedures for property-related concerns, better communication requirements, and stricter documentation before any action involving private property could occur. The room felt different when I walked out. Not because Diane had lost. Not because I had won. But because the system had finally recognized where the boundary was supposed to be. Later that evening, I stood in my backyard and looked at the fence where everything started. Months earlier, that fence represented frustration. It represented the feeling that someone could enter my space and expect me to accept it. Now, it represented something else. It represented a boundary that mattered. Diane believed her title gave her control over my property. She believed confidence could replace permission. She believed nobody would challenge her decisions. But in the end, the evidence told a different story. She didn't lose because someone fought louder. She lost because someone documented better. The most satisfying part of this entire experience wasn't seeing Diane Caldwell face consequences. It wasn't the $28,500 claim. It was standing in my own backyard again and realizing that the person who once made me question my rights had unknowingly reminded me how important those rights were. After the HOA meeting, things began to change throughout Maple Ridge Estates. The biggest difference wasn't something you could see immediately. It was the way people started speaking. Homeowners who once avoided difficult conversations began asking questions. They started reading the documents they received. They started understanding that being part of a community did not mean surrendering their voice. For months, Diane had created an environment where people assumed challenging the HOA was too difficult. But once the evidence was reviewed openly, that fear started disappearing. People realized that rules were not supposed to silence homeowners. They were supposed to create fairness. The $28,500 claim continued through the proper process, but by then, I understood something important. The money was never the main reason I took action. The number represented accountability. It represented every time my privacy was ignored, every time my questions were avoided, every time Diane believed her position gave her permission she never actually had. Looking back, I remember the first day this started. I remember standing near my fence, watching Diane explain why she was allowed to be there. At that moment, I felt frustrated because I didn't know how to respond. I wondered if fighting back would create more problems than staying quiet. But silence would have been easier for Diane, not better for me. If I had ignored the first incident, there would have been a second. If I had ignored the second, there would have been more. The pattern only stopped because someone finally decided to document it. That was the lesson I carried with me. You don't always need the loudest voice in the room. Sometimes you need the clearest. Evidence. A few months later, I walked around my backyard and looked at the same places where Diane had entered. The fence was still there. The garden was still there. The quiet morning sounds of the neighborhood were still there. But the feeling was different. That space no longer reminded me of frustration. It reminded me that boundaries exist for a reason. A property line is not just a mark on a map. It represents privacy, ownership, the right to feel secure where you live. Diane thought she was protecting the neighborhood by stepping over that line. But in the end, she showed everyone why that line mattered. The HOA eventually updated its procedures. Future property-related concerns required clearer communication and proper documentation. Homeowners were encouraged to understand their rights instead of simply accepting every decision made by someone in authority. Diane remained part of the community, but the situation changed the way people viewed leadership. A title could no longer be treated as unlimited power. It had to come with responsibility. When I think about everything that happened, I don't remember the arguments. I remember the preparation. I remember the hours spent reviewing documents. I remember choosing patience when anger would have been easier, because that was the real turning point. Diane believed she would win because she had authority. I won because I had proof. She crossed my property line believing nobody would challenge her. But every step she took created the path that led to accountability. And that was the final lesson. Rules only matter when they apply to everyone, including the people who enforce them.